Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're pleased to present a joint talk that we call Managing Massive Taxonomies to highlight some real-world enterprise-level taxonomy cases. Of particular interest to me is the negotiation between taxonomy theory, things we talk a lot about at this conference, which have to do with idealized notions of procedures and practices for managing and governing taxonomies, and the requirements in real-world situations. Constraints imposed by enterprise-level requirements sometimes conflict with idealized best practices. When engineering requires something delivered in a certain file format, that is non-negotiable. And the taxonomist and the taxonomy team and the taxonomy software must adapt to those situations because there's no room to negotiate those requirements. The requirements must be met, so the practices have to evolve to meet them. This includes adapting taxonomy software to meet evolving needs, which involves both tweaks to the existing software, as well as building new tools and utilities for specific workflows and tasks. There we go. I'm Bob Kasenchak. I'm taxonomist and senior manager for client solutions at Synaptica. I believe this is my 10th consecutive taxonomy boot camp. Hopefully we can return to in-person conferencing in the near future. We've been working with Meta for about 2.5 years. The challenges of managing a large number of very large taxonomies, as well as a large number of taxonomists, have driven us to find new solutions and methodologies for governance, workflow, mapping, and integration, by which I mean integrating taxonomies, not systems integration. That's a whole nother talk. And I'm pleased to be joined by Bonnie Bose, the senior taxonomist at Meta.
Hi there, I'm Bonnie. I've been employed as a professional taxonomist for 10 years, working on enterprise taxonomy solutions for companies ranging from oil and gas to video games to social media. I got my start in archival work at the National Gallery of Art Library, cataloging photography exhibitions, and earned my Master's of Library and Information Science at San Jose State University here in California. I'm currently working for Meta as a senior taxonomist supporting ads and business products. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the evolution of taxonomies in business and how they have increased in complexity and purpose to not only be a service to engineering, but to begin to drive product strategy, and the tooling that has had to adapt to support taxonomy build, maintenance, and the management of these systems. Taxonomies are used for multiple purposes in the tech industry, both in back-end systems to support machine learning classifier models, and also for front-end navigational purposes. A very short list of example taxonomies in action at Meta include the ads topic taxonomy to describe the aboutness of advertisements, which is roughly about 10,000 nodes. The organic interest taxonomy to describe the domain of human interest on feed to power content understanding, roughly 200,000 nodes and growing. And the folder-like categories structure of our employee knowledge library base. We also have e-commerce taxonomies to classify product categories such as services and marketplace and shops. All of these taxonomies are owned by distinct product teams supported by dedicated teams of taxonomists across the org. Next slide, please. The prevalence of taxonomies and the taxonomist with the skill set to build and maintain them has dramatically increased in a short time. I started as a full-time taxonomist at Meta in 2018, and in less than 3 years, there are now over 30 dedicated taxonomists supporting multiple product teams, indicating both that the task of building a taxonomy requires special training beyond the ad hoc accidental taxonomist capability, and that taxonomies have become necessary across more of the businesses as operations and processes have reached maturity. Okay, disclaimer, this image on the slide is not an actual Meta system. It's the assembly instructions for the Liatorp Entertainment Systems, which has been voted one of the top most complicated IKEA assembly manuals and reasons for divorce in the United States. Thank you, Reddit. Next slide, please. Now that we know where we are presently, let's take a look back at where we were. In the not so distant past, in my experience, it was not unusual for enterprise taxonomies to lack structure. Terms either existed as flat lists with little to no term disambiguation, or were compiled in loose hierarchies with semantic overlap and not Michi compliant. Tooling was sparse, Taxonomists were obliged to build and manage taxonomies with whatever tools were available. This was most likely spreadsheet software. Anyone who has ever built a taxonomy in Excel knows this pain. Efforts to create taxonomic software were not coordinated among disparate domains, and this led to interoperability issues between taxonomy teams and product. Meanwhile, the scale of taxonomies continued to soar from thousands of terms to hundreds of thousands of terms, outpacing the ability of spreadsheet input-output file transfer of data and ad hoc proprietary tooling. Also, the purpose of taxonomies is more demanding. Rather than to exhaustively describe a domain, taxonomies are the containers of mandatory and semantic metadata contained in the term record. This permits the ability to make useful associations to, records for, or observations about the elements within the domain. The data elements contained in a taxonomy can give insights to experts, and the queries of the elements of the domain can rapidly expose relevant information and supplement advanced reporting to fuel analysis and dashboards. Next slide, please. In short, taxonomy tooling must scale with the evolved business need of enterprise taxonomies. At Meta, time is truly our most valuable resource. To support the scale of business and tech, we need automated, scalable, and accurate company-wide tooling solutions. This means limited human intelligence devoted to review and approval tasks in favor of automation. It is impossible to manually manage taxonomies containing hundreds of thousands of nodes that are often in a state of constant change, pending the market and compliance regulation. We found the current tooling and processes for doing things to be highly manual, requiring hours upon hours of taxonomist review, especially for tasks such as evaluating the accuracy of term relationships, batch disambiguation and classification, and determining the semantic concept similarity between terms. Also, tooling was not designed for massive data sets. We need batch commands to edit term clusters in a single command rather than on a node-by-node basis. And tooling must be flexible and forgiving because even taxonomists make mistakes. Hashtag batch undo. Processing speed must increase to accommodate multiple editors, making constant changes to the same table at the same time, the need and the ability to refresh and propagate tables on the fly. Specialized tooling for the management of massive taxonomies means more automation, less human review, let's make the software do the work, batch commands, smart infra, and generalized APIs, and the ability to enable complex reporting features, able to perform advanced queries to glean granular insights in a single reporting tool, and agility, which to me means minimal user setup and constraints. Next slide, please. To recap, the writing on the wall in tech points to advanced tooling and fewer taxonomies. For my company, this meant taxonomy integration. Combining taxonomies to create a consolidated inference stack leads to less complexity and better engineering. Automated, accurate, and scalable tooling to accommodate the accelerated volume and scope of multi-purpose taxonomies, and the ability to easily add features and functions to accommodate unique challenges and gaps, such as the ability for batch semantic mapping and mass subsumption of the mapped pairs. Next slide, please. In my experience, the trend is towards taxonomy consolidation. But how does one combine a 100,000 node taxonomy to a 10,000 node taxonomy on a tight deadline? To evaluate the most appropriate method of taxonomy consolidation, we investigated three methodologies: mapping, merging, and integration, and weighed the benefits and the challenges of each to determine which was the most suitable to accommodate the business need. Now, most people outside of the taxonomy world do not understand the fundamental differences between these three methodologies or the maintenance and the back-end system reconfigurement that each require. Taxonomy mapping, this term is thrown around most of the time, but it means different things to different people. To an engineer, it could mean updating or mapping Hive tables, but to a taxonomist, it can mean hours of pairing semantically similar term relationships on a relevance scale. In reality, remapping tables every time there's a change in taxonomy A to taxonomy B requires maintaining multiple systems which is not an ideal situation, especially if the taxonomies are owned by multiple products and teams. Taxonomy merging is a good solution, so long as the concepts and purpose of the taxonomies match and the legacy data can be preserved as needed. Taxonomy integration requires more effort upfront and a close collaboration between taxonomy owning teams, as well as a shared system of governance after the integrated taxonomy ships. For our project, we decided to design a hybrid model between the integration and merging. To do so, we needed an automated approach to batch duplication terms and the ability to batch map and merge terms. Additionally, we needed an approach to compare terms beyond string matching and synonym rings. We needed the ability to semantically match concepts, not text strings. In short, we needed a tool that could do all three. Special thanks to Heather Hedden for providing the taxonomy consolidation definitions.
So when Meta came to us and decided that they needed to do some mapping and integration of several of their very large taxonomies in the tens of thousands of preferred terms, we thought, great, we already have a mapping utility built into our taxonomy tool that can do this work. Sorry. This tool allowed the user to establish a relationship, like a related term or map or anything else that you choose, between two taxonomies, and then compare them term to term by a selection of exact to fuzzy matching techniques. So different parameters, you can declare that the strings have to be identical, that they have a word in common, or that they have some kind of fuzzy matching. Then the list of match terms is presented to the user to validate one pair at a time to create relationships. So you could go through a list and say, yep, these are good, these are bad, and then go through the whole list. However, this tool only allowed comparison of text strings from term names and non-preferred terms. In addition, the interface to review suggested mappings struggled to scale with the volume and workflows that Meta required because their taxonomies were so big. There was no way to begin a review of some suggested mappings and then return to it later. There was no save button because, in short, this utility was developed at a time when taxonomies that our clients had in our software were generally much smaller. So we decided that to meet Meta's requirements, we had to build a new mapping tool. This new tool needed functionality enhancements, more ways to match terms, as well as new ideas about workflow and scale to allow the review process to proceed efficiently. Part of the problem was that the existing tool was only looking at term labels as strings to compare them. This meant that similar terms or synonym rings were the only fields that we could compare. The system could not take into account any other information like the path to the term, terms surrounding it in the hierarchy, or a lot of information stored as metadata as term attributes in other fields, definitions, scope notes, categories, and all kinds of other things, including links to Wikipedia URIs for equivalent concepts. And this information was extremely useful for term matching. So as we began to study this problem, my expression of the problem was this. Let's say I have two taxonomies, and in one I have a branch called drinks, and in the other one I have a branch called beverages. Maybe they both have a similar broader term like food and drink or something. And underneath these two terms on each taxonomy, you have a lot of the similar terms. You have dairy, non-alcoholic drinks, cocktails, coffee, and whatever else. So the two terms have similar parents. They have a lot of similar children, but the two strings, drinks and beverages, are not textually similar at all. Running a matching routine, no matter how fuzzy, is never going to say drinks and beverages might be the same. So we needed a way to allow the user to compare any field to any field, whether that's a note or a definition or a category, and look at other terms in the hierarchy around the term. So I can look at the broader terms, the narrower terms, the path to the term, and anything else. So we developed a way that the user can select fields to compare and a comparison method, again, from strict to fuzzy, chain them together with and or Booleans to create complex matching patterns, because Meta considers the full path of the term from the parent all the way down to the term in the hierarchy to be the semantic expression of the term. So why not be able to leverage that data? To compare terms for mapping purposes? So the new tool can evaluate a match between any selected field in taxonomy 1 and any selected field in taxonomy 2, as well as combinations of fields. So this allows the user to set up the tool based on semantic similarity beyond the term name or term label and synonyms by matching words nearby from other fields. So this example shows a query where some substring match of the full paths, they have to have part of the path has to match, must be used in conjunction with a keyword match, that is, have a word in common of their narrower terms. So I'm not even comparing the labels of the terms at all, I'm comparing their paths and their children. This process also had to run fairly quickly, even on very large data sets, because the taxonomies in question were so large. Once the list of suggested mappings is generated, we've thought very hard about what a new review interface had to look like, starting with the ability to generate a list of projected mappings and then save it, return to it later on, reprocess it, and other things like that. But the crucial time-saving functionality is the ability to filter the results and then approve or reject matches in bulk. This includes a confidence score, which I've indicated by an arrow, based on the strength of matches, which is according to the pattern selected. So exact matches get more confidence, strings with lots of words in common, whether, again, that's between two terms or a notes field or narrower terms or whatever, get more confidence based on the number of words in the match. And then you can filter the table, which might have thousands or tens of thousands results, by the confidence. So you can go look at all the ones under 40% and say, yeah, these are all bad. So instead of reviewing thousands of matches, you can review a subset of them, say, none of these look good, select all the matches with a low confidence and reject them out of hand. Or go through and say, all the things with an 80 to 100% confidence look pretty good, let's accept them en masse. This allows much faster processing than a term by term or pair by pair review, and it allows the computer to do some of the work to aid the taxonomist in making this process go much faster. So in this screenshot, the terms shown have low confidence scores based on the defined pattern. So even though graphic design and illustration software and drug design share a word in common, based on the number of words, it's still a very weak match and was assigned a probability of matching of about 20%. So after reviewing some matches with similar scores, the user could then reject all matches of 20% or less, or whatever parameter is useful. We also wanted this process to be iterative, so that the user can go run very high probability matches, very strict exact string matching, review the result set, and then run the same two taxonomies again using different parameters to generate a different result set and go through the lower confidence rankings. We also wanted this process, so while we designed this tool, for Meta's project-specific needs, we were also careful to create a generically useful tool that would be of interest for future mapping and integration projects at Meta, as well as to our other customers. So in summary, modern enterprises, in this case exemplified by big tech, are rapidly developing very large and complex taxonomy programs. And as these programs develop, the need to combine and map taxonomies that emerged from different departments that are now going to be centralized in a tool or by more centralized taxonomy teams or shared from various departments and stakeholders, among other requirements, present new challenges of scale, both the size of the taxonomies and the number of people that might need to be working in a system. So as enterprise taxonomy projects grow and scale, we need to make sure that taxonomy software evolves along with them to meet the scale and the workflows required. This includes making the software do the work as much as possible to cut down on things like manual review time, or as Bonnie said, the ability to batch edit terms, to make sure that taxonomist valuable time is reserved for tasks that cannot be accomplished or accelerated automatically. So Meta has been pushing our capabilities, and we look forward to continuing to work with them and embrace the challenges of taxonomies and big tech. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob and Bonnie. We have one question in the chat asking about, I guess, the first iteration of the mapping tool, and was it a design choice to have it not consider alternative labels in that first round of your mapping tool? Like, I can imagine that, you know, there's different mapping philosophies, I guess.
It does consider alt labels or NPTs, but terms and NPTs, strings were the only things that it could consider. But it would do synonyms for sure.
I would also say when you're working on the scale of 100,000 nodes, there just isn't the bandwidth available to go through that many nodes and assign synonyms. So we really needed another way to do this besides assigning non-preferred terms or synonyms to 100,000 terms.
Excellent. We don't have any further questions, but sometimes there's a little bit of a grokking lag between the questions and the presentation. So I think what we'll do is we'll flip over to the next case study. And if you have any questions that come to mind for this case study, you can still paste them in the chat and we'll get to them at the very end of the session.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, so now we're going to switch over to a different context. We're going to be talking about the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and we have Michelle Jenkins, who's my colleague over at DevCod Studio, and I have Nora Mitnick, who is the Director of Grant Information Systems at the Mellon Foundation. Go ahead.
Great. Hi, we're going to be doing a case study about the work that DevCod collaborated with the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation on. And my name is Michelle Jenkins. I'm a senior consultant for DevCod Studio. I'm working with Stephanie. Right now I'm based outside of Montreal, Quebec, and I do want to say that it's snowing outside.
Wow, that's crazy. I'm Nora Mitnick. I lead the Mellon Foundation's data management team, and we're based in New York City, and I, in my role, oversee data and reporting and grants management processes and workflows. So we're really excited to partner with Michelle and DevCod Studio on this project. If you go to the next slide, Michelle, we'll first walk through some of the project background and challenges. Michelle will then talk through the solution that we developed and then some lessons learned. So if you go to the next slide, just a bit about the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. We're the largest funder of the arts and humanities in the United States. We make grants in 4 core program areas: higher learning, arts and culture, public knowledge, and humanities in place. Our endowment is about $9 billion, and this year we're on track to make 500 grants totaling $500 million. So it's really important that we're able to think about our grant making across all 4 of our different program areas, and that was a key piece of this project. If you go to the next slide, last summer, we launched a new strategic plan as a social justice foundation, and we also have a new grants management system that allows for more robust coding. And at the same time, we found ourselves fielding more and more research questions that were getting really difficult to answer across program areas. So the goal for this project was to really review and optimize the foundation's grant classification, taxonomy, and think about ways that we could develop a more robust coding schema to better support reporting and strategic planning. We wanted to come up with a way that we could zoom in and out, looking at information at a really high level. How much has the foundation done in the arts? How much have we done in dance and tap and jazz and ballet? So really going for that macro and micro view, and again, wanting to be able to look across the organization as a whole. If you go to the next slide, just a bit more background on the previous taxonomy. The foundation is 50 years old, and the taxonomy had not been restructured or looked at in a major way since its inception, which is awesome in a way because it means that we have really clean data, and the taxonomy was used according to historical precedents. So that made the mapping in a way a bit easier, but each program area had their own taxonomy without centralized governance. So the taxonomies included terms about different things. What is the grant organization type? What is the grant activity? And all in a hierarchy for each program area. So really difficult to answer questions across all program areas. And again, the hierarchies kind of grew and evolved over time in conjunction with focus area tags that had a lot of overlapping or unused tags and weren't used consistently. So we wanted to make sure that we were able to map to this taxonomy, but that we had something that was a bit more structured. If you go to the next slide, just a bit about Flux, our grants management system. Flux does have the ability to have hierarchical values, conditional logic. So if something is a higher education grant, add these additional fields or values, but it's not a taxonomy management system. So unfortunately, it doesn't have the ability to have synonyms or scope notes, definitions for each term. So if we want to say, okay, this grant is focused on lawyers, we also need to have attorneys in case people are looking for that term. So we did think about synonyms and building that into the taxonomy as part of our development process. We really wanted to keep the taxonomy in the grants management system because that's where all of our grants and metadata live. You can go to the next slide. We are hoping to use the taxonomy to really be able to find better information on our grants and understand our grant making. So to be able to say, give me all of the grants that are focused on Indigenous language preservation and have that as a group so that we can amplify that story. We are wanting to be able to say, what has the foundation done, in support of monuments or in support of education? So even though the arts program is focused on arts, other program areas may be making grants in those areas as well. So being able to group things together so that we can amplify and better communicate our work. And I will turn it over to Michelle.
Great, thank you very much. So the Mellon Foundation reached out to Dovecot to help with this restructuring. They were very aware of the situation and the problems that they had, and they could see that the single hierarchy that combined so many different kinds of things into one monolithic taxonomy was not going to scale, and they were going to have to kind of change the whole thing every time they had a new program area or restructured the organization or refocused their strategy, because that is going to happen again. It's a long-standing organization. It has quite a past and clearly quite a future. So they needed to have something that was more flexible and really think it out in a holistic, comprehensive way, where they thought we need some taxonomy expertise from outside to come in and do this leveling up and get them positioned and get them the governance in place so that they can carry it forward. So the strategy that we came up with, and this was a wonderful project because it was so collaborative. It was not a case where sometimes clients say, here's our situation, go come up with some solutions and come back. And we have to sort of say, actually, we need to work closely with you and your stakeholders and subject matter experts. This was a very immersive experience as a consultant, which was great. Everybody was really interested in talking about taxonomy, sharing their experiences. So I learned a lot about grant making, but what we came up with was that they needed a multifaceted approach to focus on all the different aspects of grant making. And we needed to clarify a distinction in the vocabularies they were using between what we termed the descriptive classifications, which would be stable and enduring over time and very semantic, versus the strategic evolving classifications that were still really important. They need to tie grant making to the current strategies, both at the foundation level and each program area, but with the awareness that those might change, either the way they just talk about them or even the focus of the organization. So 50 years ago, there was not a strategic view to have a social justice lens, and now there is. And 50 years from now, there might be something different. So they have to serve that purpose here and now, but to be able to connect to the things that were all Indigenous language preservation or ballet across those strategic evolutions. So we came up with a cross-program area approach for descriptive classifications. Even if a program area wants to code with their specific strategy that's only relevant to them, they also needed to code with things that were cross-organization. So whether they were doing ballet under one program area or another program area, the organization knew those two things were happening and they were the same thing. We want to define each concept once and have an agreed upon label to ensure consistency of meaning. So those basic tenets of taxonomy development. I also want to say that we really focused on grant management with influx. This wasn't an enterprise taxonomy approach. We had a single system and a single kind of content, but we did cast a little bit of a wider glance for potential uses in the future around document management, contracts, assets, even public facing websites, filtering on the database that's available to the public that has just a limited amount of information. So we did meet a lot with the communications team about their public facing website as well. And it'll be really neat to see if this work that we've done can be leveraged in other parts of the organization going forward. Another consideration with working closely with the organization was that we didn't want to overwhelm people with taxonomy jargon, and we wanted to work really closely with the folks working on grants and who would be coding the grants, but it wasn't, their problem to fully immerse themselves in taxonomy and SCOS and NPTs and facets and all those things we like to throw around. So early on, we decided to have an approach where we talked about coding instead of tagging and codes instead of terms, because that was the terminology used in-house, using classification instead of taxonomy, and categories instead of facets. We slipped up a little bit towards the end because we started to feel that people had been absorbing some of this as we go along. So they were a little bit more comfortable with these terms, but in terms of documentation and training, we really tried to protect them from some of the complexity behind the scenes. So there was a real different approach between the core taxonomy team, myself, and representatives from different parts of Mellon, and then how we interacted with the wider stakeholder group. We used a lot of accessible analogies and examples, whether it was talking about the fruit stand and whether we need Myers lemons or just citrus, or whether we talked about everybody really, for some reason, glommed on to this wine facet analogy, and they'd be like, bring the wine slide up. Let's look at the wine slide. That will help us. So we took a couple of examples early on and really carried that through the whole process, whether we were talking about term selection or structure or hierarchy or governance. We could go back to our fruit stand and our wine bottles and connect it back. We also tried to make sure that we didn't get too academic about things and that we didn't get too caught up in some of the possible edge cases that we could all theorize, and instead really come back to rationales and research questions. What are we trying to give access to? What questions are we trying to answer? And then here, because we're not sharing the original taxonomy, this is the example that we used as we were educating people about our approach, is that you could have a hierarchy of wines, and if you had a single hierarchy, you would end up repeating things like red varietals, and red wines are all the same things, but because Napa Valley made theirs red wine, capital R, capital W, and the California folks, some of them decided on red and some on red varietals, you miss the fact that these are all the same things because everybody has their own hierarchy. You're also mixing kinds of things under a single list. And if you wanted to add something, say under Oregon and Washington, you expanded out, you would have to rebuild a lot of this structure. You would end up repeating things in multiple places. So you could see quite simply that a single monolithic hierarchy, in this case, places or program areas, gets repetitious, it gets bloated, it doesn't scale well. And what we could see instead is if you have a couple of very clean, simple facets, and somebody's going to call out and say these are authority records and not taxonomy, but you can see me after the talk, just to explain that if you want to add rosé, it just goes in one place and everybody knows that it's rosé, and it can be used in combination with California, Oregon, or Washington in order to build more complex things. So the general high-level process we took was designing that strategy, some high-level domain modeling. It turns out grant making is very complicated. It has a lot of moving pieces and people, and there isn't always a common language about how to discuss it. So it's very useful for me to have that domain modeling step, breaking it down into facets. What do we need to describe about these different entities in the domain? And then having a checkpoint to validate with stakeholders just about the strategy and our understanding of what we need to talk about and what was important to them. We then populated these facets with existing terms. So took all the current taxonomy, those kind of free keywords in the focus area tags, threw them all down on the floor and started going through and Marie Kondoing our way to what was useful, what could be combined, what could be cleaned up. Then identified the gaps through some workshops and looking at external sources. Then another checkpoint to validate with stakeholders, do we have the right facets and are we populating them correctly? And finally, mapping those facets to flux fields and properties. So some facets power more than one field, which was great because we could reuse the same kind of list in multiple places. And we knew that users would get more familiar with them by seeing them more than once. We did find that there was a lot of adjustments around how Flux actually works and what that end user experience would be. And we ended up circling back and making adjustments as needed. For comparison and benchmarking, we looked at, some of you might be familiar with the Candid taxonomy. It's a taxonomy that's publicly available. It's about grant making, but it's very broad and shallow. And we quickly found that whether we were looking at other taxonomies in arts or humanities, even university curriculum, other grant websites, Mellon has a very unique viewpoint and specific priorities that we just didn't see in other places. So even though we got some inspiration and possibly cherry-picked a few terms here and there, we really didn't find anything that we thought we could take wholesale. We really needed a custom, from the ground up solution based on Mellon's perspective and needs. This is just a hint of kind of the domain modeling we did. You can see that there's a lot of arrows and boxes and a lot of conversations around it, but I found it really useful as someone who is outside of the grant making world to just work through this process of what grant making means, what are the different roles and entities involved in it. So we had a couple iterations of this just to work through that, and then distilled it down to a much more simpler high-level domain model that captured what we needed to say about grants and what we needed to describe. Then for each of those kind of entities or domains, we then figured out what we needed to capture in a property or a facet populated by a facet. So in this case, we're talking about places. And we found that for a place, we needed to have the point on the map. So, you know, the address itself, which is useful, but did not give the full view of what kind of place that was. So we reused our list of organization types for an activity setting. So and then added a couple more, like, is this in a digital space? Is it a prison and detention center or public park? Where is not just the grant being made to, you know, a building that's on 7th Avenue, but the work of the grant is happening in a public park. They're going to have a garden or they're going to have a theater production. And then additional location characteristics. Again, all of this was to keep each list as small as possible. So you can then use public park with rural area or tribal area or urban or metropolitan area, rather than have that all laid out in a big, long hierarchy. Another example is organizations. We have both an organization type. There had to be one, which was very challenging to just pick one descriptor for the organization type. And then you could sprinkle on organizational characteristics to add more nuance to the sector, the geographic reach, the kind of leadership of that organization. Here's a hint of some of the activities we did because of COVID, couldn't go be in person with Post-it notes and a whiteboard. So we did our best using Miro to do several iterations of brainstorming, grouping, discarding, discussing all the potential candidates to fill in more of the taxonomy. And then using optimal sorts, card sorting, and click trees to both generate ideas and validate decisions about groupings and hierarchies. For managing the taxonomy, because again, this isn't an enterprise taxonomy, there wasn't really a need to have a true taxonomy management tool that was integrated and feeding several systems, but we did want something a little bit more than a spreadsheet. So we are working with Airtable as the source of truth for the taxonomy. Now, this is just for the core taxonomy team and the taxonomy development. It's not meant for a coder or other stakeholders to go in there because it is a little overwhelming It isn't totally user-friendly in the way that it manages hierarchies. You kind of have to hack out a way of managing a hierarchy, and I don't think it would scale for something much more complex than this, but we found it really useful to both capture the administrative metadata, like what's approved, what needs review, does it need review from the consultant or from in-house, what comments we have and discussions. It has built-in change tracking. So if you change a label, it just captures that and who did it. So you have your audit trail and you're like, wait, did we change that label? Did we change it back? And you can go and see that listing of what has happened with it. And then you're able to have different views, filtering on different properties to have a quick list of here are all the ones that don't have scope notes, or here are all the ones that were deprecated. So that worked very well for us. But as I said, it wasn't friendly in terms of the coders using it for reference. So we used another tool called Dynalist, which is very simple hierarchical lists, and you can collapse and expand at each point in the hierarchy, and it does allow for a single note underneath it. So we created a read-only version. One facet has a page and clickable expandable hierarchy, and just has the information that's important to grant coders. So they're able to use this as an additional reference if they want to know how we've scoped or defined something. And then we were able to embed this into a frame on the intranet. So as far as they're concerned, they go to the taxonomy part of the website, intranet website, and the taxonomy is available in there in this easy to use format. I'll switch it back over to Laura.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. That's such a nice high-level overview. Taxonomy governance was really central throughout this project. I think one of the pain points previously was that the taxonomy wasn't centrally managed. So we wanted to make sure that we're going through this huge, intensive taxonomy development process, that we come up with a governance plan so we can continue to manage the taxonomy after it's in place. We definitely, with Michelle's coaching, understand that the taxonomy is not something we can just put on a shelf and be done with, but that it will involve continuous management as, you know, the world evolves and the foundation evolves, and it's something that we'll need to manage and pay close attention to. If you go to the next slide, Michelle, one thing that Michelle mentioned, we had a centralized taxonomy core team throughout the development process that had staff from operations teams, data management, research, and library. And we worked closely with stakeholders from across the organization to make sure that all input was balanced and consistently reviewed and incorporated into the taxonomy. That structure works really well. So we actually decided to keep that post-taxonomy launch, have the taxonomy core team serve as the centralized hub and of the governance of the taxonomy, working closely with stakeholders and bringing people in as appropriate so we can review everything in a similar way and make sure that we are balancing input from across the organization. If you go to the next slide, Michelle, one thing we kept a big focus on throughout the project was documentation. So Airtable was a huge source of truth. It was really helpful to understand and document why decisions were made, and it helped us from revisiting the same decisions over and over again. Having a governance plan documented in place also enabled us to act quickly when we receive feedback with a plan of who is going to be responsible for reviewing and approving that feedback. So we developed a RACI, responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed, of exactly who would need to be consulted for every single change. We also put together style guidelines, checklists, what to do when we're adding a term, removing a term. This is so helpful, especially now that the taxonomy is launched and we're not in the weeds as much on the day-to-day. Having this in place is really useful. If you go to the next slide, as Michelle mentioned, we looked at the candid taxonomy throughout the development process, and we do want to map the Mellon taxonomy to the candid taxonomy. Mellon and other funders provide their grant making information to Candid on an annual basis. So grant seekers and nonprofits can look to see who's funding work in their areas, and it can be used for research purposes. Since Candid is used across the philanthropy sector, in a lot of cases, we're rolling up when we're mapping. So if Mellon is coding a grant for tap, jazz, and ballet, to Candid, we would probably report that as dance or even arts. So that's been a really useful exercise. We're also mapping historically to our retrospective taxonomy. We're not actually changing the codes on our historical grants. Instead, we're going to apply the new taxonomy codes in addition to them. For ease of reporting, it's really important that the foundation is able to tell our story and understand our work, both historically and in the future. So having everything in one taxonomy in one place will be really useful. Training was key as we launched the taxonomy. Seeing the taxonomy live in the system, even though we checked in with stakeholders throughout the process, was, I just should say, like, cannot be understated how helpful that is. And it really solicited helpful additional feedback. So we had 4 hours of intensive, kind of really fun, we tried to make them very interactive, taxonomy training for all staff. And then we had one-on-one coding sessions with every single person who's responsible for coding a grant in Flex, where we coded a grant together that they were working on in real time. And we got some really great feedback from those sessions. They were extremely useful. And I think the one-on-one attention went a long way. Some lessons learned throughout the project. If you go to the next slide, Michelle, having executive buy-in was key. Our executives really forced us to think strategically, look across our grant making. Checking in with stakeholders throughout the process was really useful, really wanting to understand what people will use the taxonomy for. We tried to take a research question approach. What are the research questions that we're getting asked now? What are the questions, that we hope we can answer in the future? So making sure that we're incorporating everyone's needs and future needs into the taxonomy, especially since the taxonomy core team is living in the weeds of the taxonomy every day. It's really important to check in with stakeholders and make sure everyone is brought along for the process. Throughout the process, we also, working across program areas was really interesting, and it was great to be able to see, okay, where are we talking about the same thing and where are we talking about two different things? Residencies and fellowships is a great example, because we originally thought, okay, residencies and fellowships, very similar. They can both roll up under professional development. They're the same thing. But actually fellowships do roll up into professional development, but our arts program really felt residency should roll up under creative development. It's something different and separate and distinct from a fellowship that should be treated as such. So understanding that nuance and working really closely with stakeholders and experts at the organization was really helpful. Change management was a key piece of the project. This is a totally new way of thinking about our grant making, breaking things down into categories or facets. What is the grant subject? What is the grant activity? What is the organization type? Instead of having this long hierarchical list that really people were very used to. So it was important, again, to bring people along through the taxonomy development journey and to figure out, okay, where is there a problem, or where is this actually a learning opportunity? So having those multiple checkpoints was really helpful, and having the governance plan documented, again, I can't understate how useful that was, because then we were able to just act quickly, incorporate things, and it's not a question of who needs to review this, who do we need to check in with. We know right away, based on the feedback and the type of change that we're considering, who we need to consult with and how we can get that done. Michelle talked about Airtable and Dynalist, and then we also have Flex, our grants management system. So right now, those are 3 separate and distinct places where the taxonomy is stored, and we're still working between them manually. I think that's something we could think about improving in the future, so that we don't have to, every time we make a taxonomy change, make it in 3 different places. We did think a lot about this throughout the development process, because we don't have a million entities like Meta in our taxonomy, so it is more manageable that we can do things manually, but it still would be helpful to have them, I think, be integrated a little bit more closely. So I hope this was helpful. I learned so much from working with Michelle and Dovecot, and I'm really excited to see the taxonomy in fruition. We just launched in September, so it's been a very exciting year. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Nora. Thank you, Michelle. We have a few questions that are rolling in, so I'll jump right into those. First question is from Rosanna, and she's asking if you did personas or any kind of audience definition at the beginning of the project to try to understand who needed what kind of information. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
It was interesting because this was internal facing only, and we spoke very directly with the coders, and more of a stand-in for the information request was the requests that the information specialists have been getting in the past, and they had to spend a lot of time literally going manually through different grants, trying to pull together a collection to deliver. So we did have quite a list of the last few years of research questions, but part of the problem is that there hadn't been this sort of access to grants, so people don't even really think of wanting the information. So there's a lot of potential in the future for doing new things and even using the metadata on the grants to do things like what percentage of our grants in this strategy went to BIPOC undergrad students. And that's not actually like, give me the grants or how many grants, but using that information to say more about the work itself. So a lot of it's brand new. So we didn't have that persona layer as much. Nora, did you have anything to add?
No, I think that's really helpful. I mean, I guess I would just add that I think we did do a lot of work with communications and research. So in addition to the people coding and program staff trying to figure out, okay, externally, how can this information be used as well? And the mapping to Candid was a key piece of the project, wanting to be able to connect our taxonomy to others in the philanthropic space.
Mm-hmm.
Next question is from Chelsea. She's asking how many people make up your core taxonomy team and how many people are involved in the governance process?
The taxonomy team was a small but mighty team of 4 people, and then Michelle and another consultant from Dovecot. So I actually think having a small core group was helpful because it allowed us to be nimble. And I think, you know, in project management, you want to make sure everybody is looped into the project and at all times. So I think if it was any bigger, it could have been hard to manage all of the information associated with the project because it was so detail oriented. Yeah, what was the second part of the question, Stephanie?
How many people are involved in the whole governance process?
In the whole governance process, I mean, it's interesting. We have advisors, I would say, from each of the core teams and business units that we can consult with if a change is needed. So it really depends on the type of change and governance that we're working on, but we do have representatives and advisors from each area.
And I think it's interesting to note too that on your taxonomy team, none of you were taxonomy experts or are taxonomists, right?
No.
Would you consider yourself one now?
I don't know, but I've learned a lot from working with Michelle. And before we started working with Dovecot, I think one of your clients said, I've learned so much. And that is truly how I feel. I feel like this has been such a great learning opportunity for me and for everyone at Mellon. Somebody came into my office today and was like, I was thinking about the taxonomy, you know, historically, and now it's so intuitive. And I do think a lot about that with training new staff that are going to be coming on board. It's like, this is just the way we code and the metadata. It is, you don't have to have that historical background of this hierarchy was developed like this because XYZ and this person was on the board and whatever it is. It's much more straightforward, I think, about what is the grant about. That's what we're really trying to capture. So that was such a nice comment this morning. So it's great.
We have a question about executive buy-in. You mentioned how executive buy-in and implied central direction played a crucial role. They're asking if you have any ideas on how you can achieve that when there are multiple executive levels involved or across different business units or organizations.
Yeah, I think for us, the executive sponsor was the EVP and COO. So she was really involved with the project, and we met with her on a monthly basis for strategic direction and questions. We also met with the president at key decision points throughout the process. So this is our strategy, this is what we're thinking, these are the categories we've developed, and then these are the terms. So I think figuring out what is the role for each executive and when you can bring them into the process and having that clearly laid out was really helpful for us.
We made a lot of presentations.
Yes.
A lot of cases where we had our deliverable would be a very detailed, for example, the full governance plan. And then we had a high level version of that for key stakeholders. And then we had a high level version of that for our executive sponsor. And then we had a 4 slides for the president. And so you get the buy-in at each level, and people have less and less bandwidth as you go up, and they need a more concise summary of what they need to know at each of those levels. But I do have to say it was lots of presentations.
Yes, lots of presentations and lots of trainings. I think we erred on the side of overtraining in a way because this is totally new for the foundation. So wanting to make sure that we spent time with every single person at multiple times.
You mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that Mellon is kind of shifting into more of a social justice lens. And I think there's quite a bit of velocity of change these days in that sort of subject area. What are your plans longer term in terms of keeping that taxonomy relevant and intuitive and up to date and matching your strategy? So it had been sort of 50 years. How often do you think you'll revisit or open up the taxonomy to that kind of input and feedback?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I hope that the structure is enduring. Like, I hope the structure of the taxonomy is enduring and lasts over time, but you can change labels to terms. So if a label changes or a term changes, that we can do easily and continue to manage. I think the strategic codes, as Michelle mentioned, we did keep separate from the more descriptive characteristic codes. So we have high level foundation strategies that each grant is coded with and program area strategies. You expect those to change over time as new strategic plans are launched every few years. And then separately, we have the taxonomy, which has, grant subject, grant activity, organization type. And you expect those to change, but a fellowship was a fellowship 20 years ago. So I think keeping those kind of enduring codes separate will be really helpful in terms of taxonomy management. But I just sent out the first taxonomy change log email this week, 2 months post-launch, and there was actually only 5 codes that changed. This is not a huge taxonomy. I think we have, Michelle, maybe a few hundred codes. So it's manageable, but it's interesting. Like, I got feedback earlier this week that we have a code for community-based and local organizations, and the word community is really throwing people off. So I think it was really helpful that we developed scope notes and definitions for each term so that we can say, okay, go to the scope note, what does it say? And we can also adjust those over time.
I think that is it question-wise. Last call. I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Bob and Bonnie from Synaptica and Meta, and Michelle and Nora from Dovecot and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Thank you very much for your in-depth case studies. And if anyone has any other questions, please feel free. You can use the private chats if you like, or the networking section over on the left-hand side in Feedloop. And we'll have another session starting in about 15 minutes. Thank you very much.